Most new investors think that leverage is a dream come true. That is, until it turns into their worst nightmare. In today's episode of Investing in Bryan-College Station, we're going to discuss the pros and cons of using leverage to grow your real estate portfolio. Of course, all of that and more on your favorite channel, Investing in Bryan-College Station, where I cover everything about growing your wealth through real estate in my favorite towns of Bryan and College Station. Guys, stay tuned. This is going to be a good one. And as always, I have bonus content at the end. If you're new to the channel, you don't know who I am, hello, my name is Greg Schwartz. I've been investing here in Bryan and College Station for the last 5 years. I also worked as a property manager where I managed over 150 properties. Today, my wife and I run our portfolio of 26 units, everything from long-term to short-term, and I also work with investors like yourself every single day to help them grow their wealth through real estate here in Bryan and College Station, Texas. And guys, in today's video, we'll discuss exactly what is leverage, how and why we should use leverage to our advantage, but also what are the risks and disadvantages to using leverage. I'll use a real-life case study to drive this point home, and at the end, I will answer a client question in our bonus content. So let's jump right in. Guys, what is leverage? Well, for me to wrap my brain around leverage, I like to think of a big old seesaw, like you'd have on a playground when you were a kid. On one side of the seesaw, there's Greg. I'm not a very big dude. On the other side of the seesaw is a fat kid. In the middle, that point that the seesaw teeters on is called a fulcrum. Now, if I move the fulcrum closer to the fat kid, I can lift him more easily. It takes less force to lift the heavier load on the other end. Now, if I move the fulcrum to the other end, I'm deleveraging. And I'm using more force to lift said fat kid. Well, the same way that leverage helps us lift the fat kid, it also lets us buy more real estate. In this case, the leverage, instead of being a seesaw, is debt, other people's money. So the more money we take on, the more debt that we take on, the less we come out of pocket. So let's use an example of a $200,000 house. If I were to put 5% down, we're talking $10,000. So with just $10,000, 5% down, that's 95% loan to value. The banks think of it in loan to value. So you should too. And that's called LTV, loan to value. 95% loan to value is the equivalent of 5% down. So $10,000 buys you a $200,000 house. Now, most investors are putting 20 to 25% down. 25% down on a $200,000 house is $50,000. That's a lot more money, so the fulcrum is deleveraging. And then, of course, 50% loan to value would be the equivalent of 50% down, $100,000 to buy that $200,000 house. And then lastly, if you want to have no leverage at all, you would be a cash buyer. You would just have a cool $200,000 laying around, and you would just buy the house with that. You wouldn't have any leverage, but you also wouldn't have any risk. You see, the advantages to leverage is you can put less money into a deal to buy and control a more expensive asset. As a result, you also get outsized returns when it comes to the appreciation of that asset. For example, if you put 20% down, you are getting a 5-to-1 ratio multiple on the appreciation. For every 1% of appreciation, you get a 5x return on your investment. So if the house appreciates by 5%, you actually get a 25% ROI, and that's pretty damn cool. Of course, if you're a cash buyer, you're completely deleveraged. Every 1% is a 1% return. 1% appreciation, 1% return. What about the disadvantages? Well, see, the biggest disadvantage to being leveraged is, one, you have a monthly payment every single month. And that's an expense. That's a real world expense you've got to overcome if your income from the rent doesn't cover that, or your income from your job doesn't cover that, then you could lose the property. And that could be hugely detrimental. Even more so if you're extremely high leverage. So again, let's look at that $200,000 house. Let's assume you only put 5% down. So you only put $10K down. So the bank has a note for $190,000. If you have to sell that house, you're gonna have fees associated with it. Let's assume you have to sell the house a year later and the market dropped like we saw in Austin. It's down 10%. The house is only worth $180,000. Plus you have closing costs, realtor fees. Now you might only get a check for, let's call it $170,000 at closing, but you owe the bank $190,000. Guess where that $20,000 difference comes from? It comes from your pocket. See, that is the risk of being over leveraged. So if you're over leveraged and you sell, you might have to come out of pocket. And of course, the debt can be more expensive. So are there ways to maximize this leverage? Absolutely. A few ways that I know off the top of my head that you can use zero money out of pocket would be like a VA loan. My veterans and my active duty service members have access to a zero money down loan called a VA loan. You have to live in the house, but of course, if you're house hacking, that still allows you to buy it as an investment property. But again, if you have to sell that house in less than 2 or 3 years, there's a good chance you'll come out of pocket in that sale. And that, of course, is risky. You could also use creative financing. For example, a owner might be willing to sell or finance a house to you for 100% LTV, 100% loan to value, meaning you buy that $200,000 house and they lend you the $200,000 to do it. You just pay that owner every single month. And then lastly, you could combine debts. So let's say that the bank will give you $150,000. That's 75% loan to value. They give you $150K. You still have $50K you got to come up with to buy the house. So you go to your neighbor. He knows that you invest in real estate and he's willing to give you $50K. $150 from the bank, $50K from your neighbor, $200,000 purchase. You don't come out of pocket at all to buy that house. So let's look at a real world example of using leverage and how that affects your overall ROI, or even to talk about cash flow, because of course, debt comes with its own expenses. I'm going to lay out 3 scenarios for you to really drive the point home. These 3 scenarios are going to be 20% down, 50% down, and cash buyer. I'm not using a no down payment strategy here because I personally put money into every single deal and I don't believe in being over leveraged. Okay, so in each of these scenarios, we're going to be buying a $200,000 house. That $200,000 house will appreciate by 4% per year. It will rent out for $1,600 a month, and it will have fixed expenses outside of the debt of insurance, property tax, and other expenses. Think maintenance, vacancies, property management expenses. In total, it'll have $700 worth of expenses every single month, and then we will have to pay the principal and interest payment based on the debt that we took. So let's look at each one of these scenarios and see how much cash flow, how much equity, and how much overall return we see in each scenario. Don't worry, guys. I did all the nerding for you. All you need to do is follow along on the chart in front of you. As you can see, scenario 1 is our 20% down scenario. And as we go to the right, we deleverage. 50% down, then 100% down. Naturally, when you have higher leverage, you're putting less money into the deal. So your down payment gets higher from 20% to 50% to 100%. And of course, when you put less money down, your loan is higher, so your monthly principal and interest payment also decreases as you go from left to right on this chart. We do have fixed expenses that I account for in every scenario. That's going to be your taxes, your insurance. Other expenses include things like vacancies, maintenance costs, or property management. And then in all scenarios, we're making $1,600 a month. So let's look at our cash flow. Our cash flow is actually way better when we are a cash buyer. In fact, that cash buyer is making nearly $11,000 a year, whereas our leveraged buyer with 20% down is negative nearly $2,000 a year. Cash on cash basis, that means that our 20% down buyer has a negative 4.88% cash on cash return. Our 50% down buyer has a 2.84% cash on cash return. And our cash buyer has the strongest cash flow at 5.41% cash on cash return. Now, in all 3 scenarios, the houses are going to appreciate by $8,000 per year. But because we're putting different amounts of money into the deal, our percent return on that equity growth differs. In scenario 1, that $8,000 is a 20% return on our investment. In scenario 2, the $8,000 is an 8% return on our initial $100K investment. And in scenario 3, we put $200,000 in the deal. We made $8,000, which is a 4% return. In all these scenarios, that $8,000 is representative of a 4% appreciation, which is actually a pretty conservative appreciation for here in Bryan-College Station. Okay, so let's combine cash flow and appreciation. In scenario 1, where we are the most leveraged, we make the least amount of money, $6,000. Whereas our cash buyer makes the most amount of money, nearly $19,000. But let's look at their ROI. At 20% down, you make $6,000 and your return on your investment is right around 15%. At 50% down, you're making nearly $11,000 on the year and your return is nearly 11%. And in the cash buyer scenario, you're making a whopping $18,820, but your return is only a 9.41%. As you can see, your ROI is way better in the leveraged position, despite negative cash flow. And I've said this before, guys, cash flow is not nearly as important as the appreciation for my leveraged investors. And this is a case in point right here. But now it begs the question of what is a safe leverage? What is a good amount to put down, what would Greg do? Which brings me to my bonus content and client question. Is actually a question my client asked me at dinner the other night, and we were talking about leverage, and they said, Greg, for your portfolio, for your risk tolerance, what do you like to see as a down payment? And then also, what is your portfolio right now in terms of loan to value? And I've put a lot of thought to this. And I really think back to one of the biggest downturns of this century, and that was 2008, 2009, where properties lost around 20 to 30% in value. So I always think, if my properties lost that much in value, would I be upside down on my properties? If I had to sell, would I have to come out of pocket? Because of course, at that point, if values are dropping by that much, I probably don't have a lot of money out of pocket. So I probably don't have cash reserves at that point. We're probably hurting. So I don't want to have to come out of pocket if I have to sell a property. And then ultimately, I don't want to have a lot of debt on my property because that's a lot of expenses. So if we are in a downturn and renters can't pay, I also don't want to be burdened with that debt. So for me, I always like to put at least 25% down on my investment property. And my portfolio, as it sits today, is between 60 and 65% loan to value, which means I have 35 to 40% equity across my portfolio. So hopefully that gives you a point of reference for how you can build your portfolio in what I deem as a low risk, high return manner. Guys, I hope this provides some value. If so, go ahead and click the like button. Definitely hit the subscribe button because I will be dropping a new video every single week. And the only ask that I have is until next week, you take it easy.